Well, welcome everyone. We are at episode 2, and the purpose of this podcast is to provide you with some ideas and some inspiration on improving your funeral home's operations and connecting with more families. And by the way, this podcast is brought to you by our friends at Passari. So my name is Todd Carlson. I'm the Chief Sales Officer with Directors Investment Group, and that our family of companies includes Passari. And if you recall in our inaugural episode, our goals were really twofold. One is to figure out what we were going to call this thing. And we have a reveal coming later on that in just a few minutes here. But the other goal of the first episode was to introduce you to our recurring cast of characters, and use the term character. Define that yourselves. All right. But again, with us today, Matt Bailey. Welcome back. I'm glad you came back for a second episode. Bailey Family Funeral Homes in Connecticut. We've got Gary Freitag with us here from Spring Grove in Cincinnati, Ohio. And then, of course, Jimmy Lucas here from Fort Worth, Texas, from the Lucas family of funeral homes. So hey, welcome back, everyone. How's your day been so far?
Chock full of excitement and opportunity, Todd. Thanks for asking.
So, Jimmy, you were supposed to say this is the highlight right here. So, all right, well. Hey, so let's get back, so after some, very, it was rounds and rounds of ranked ballot voting here, right? We, sifted, we shook, we negotiated, and we settled on a name for the podcast. And I'm a little bit shocked that we were able to come to an agreement. So, I don't know if there's if someone plays a musical instrument, we could do the ta-da thing. On a keyboard or something, but
like the little thing that you wind up.
Yes.
Jack in the Box?
The Jock in a Box.
There you go.
Well, we thought that'd be our theme song, Jimmy.
Yeah, I know Gary has one. He's just playing coy now.
Pop Goes the Weasel, baby, our theme song. All right. Hey, but we have settled on the graveyard shift. So, all right. So, Gary, what's your take on that name?
I like it. It also indicates that we're not just going to talk about funerals. Some of the other names we looked at were definitely more funeral focused. But we were trying to figure out, the hardest thing about coming up with a name was to try to convey the fun or the whimsy that this group has when we get together. It's kind of hard to do in 2 or 3 words, but I'm happy with Graveyard Shift. I thought some of the others were a little bit more creative, but I'm not sure how well they work as a podcast. So I'm happy with it.
All right. Well, thanks, Gary. So, Matt, what are your impressions?
Oh, I was against it.
I was a hard no.
I was a hard no. Listen, I think like Gary said, I think it implies a lot of things. It talks about, obviously people hear graveyard shift and think of your shift of work, but in terms of the shift necessary in our profession and our society and how it is that we remain relevant to our client families, I think it has a good meaning behind it, and I'm excited to see where it leads us.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming back to episode number 2. Matt, he was negotiating for a more salary, and we explained that we would double it, and so he was happy about that. So
finally got him caught around.
Yes,
I found a blue M&M in the bowl here, by the way. So if it happens again, we cancel the podcast immediately.
We're done.
That's going to be somebody's head on a pike.
All right, Jimmy, let's give us some of your deep thoughts from Fort Worth, Texas.
So, I love the name, actually. I definitely went humor on it. Matt put way more thought into how that can contribute to our day-to-day work with families. I love that part of it. But Graveyard Shift, I just see these 2 other guys, Gary and Matt, and makes me giggle. So taking a serious job and being able to decompress, and it's almost like the C team on the junior high basketball team. I feel like that's what we are here. And if we can bring a little good information and bring some folks onto the show to be a part of the Graveyard Shift, I think that's the meaning for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I was just, as y'all came into the podcast today and, coming from a busy day's work, just I think as we think about our listeners here, one thing that we've just noticed is, my take on funeral service has really never been harder than it is right now to be a funeral professional, right? And, I think at the end of the day, many times, you get to drag yourself to the end of the day. It's been a challenging day. And you ask this kind of one basic question is, did what I do today matter? Right. And so I thought maybe we could explore on this episode, maybe jumping into a favorite topic of mine, is this whole idea of what makes for a great funeral, and the impact of a great funeral on the people around us and the families we serve. So maybe we'll talk a little bit too about why great funerals matter to this business, right? So maybe this will be an interesting discussion. So Matt, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you. Could you give us a little insight on the best funeral that your team ever delivered?
Todd, I always like to say, I believe our best funeral will be our next funeral.
Wow.
Oh, I'm out. Wonderfully erudite of you.
No,
that's a great attitude.
There's several that come to mind. I think there's one that I probably talk about the most when I'm sharing stories with colleagues, or if I'm just chatting with people and what a funeral can look like. And it goes back to earlier in my career, and it's a situation where I can't take the credit for it, and that's I think also probably a whole side conversation, because I often hear funeral directors tell a story about a great funeral, and very often the tragedy behind it is the funeral director did not have the role in putting it together. And that's, again, we could really talk about that for a long time. But there's one that comes to mind early on in my career. I was probably licensed for a year or so, and we were taking care of a gentleman who spent his life working in the theater. We're not that far from New York where we are, so we have people that have connections to the city, and he worked on Broadway, and they transformed the funeral home chapel into a theater, and they made it look like they dimmed the lights, and we had velvet ropes, and we kind of did a little set design, and they had music playing, and his program was a playbill, the yellow covered playbill that you get when you go to Broadway, and they put together little snippets where you would have a portion of a song from one of the performances that he had been involved with, and then someone would get up and they would speak about him, and they intertwined it well. And the reason why I mentioned that one is because early on in my career, it helped me see what was possible and what people could do. So I saw that experience, and I saw the people walking out the door, and the power that it had for them. And it spoke a lot to me in terms of the potential of what we do. So we've had other funerals since then, and I'm sure we'll have time to explore, but that's the one that I often go back to because it was so touching and moving in a lot of ways.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And I agree with you. I think many of the stories I hear also of great funerals is where the family brought the idea to the funeral director. So why don't you unpack a little bit, maybe for our listeners, a little bit about how the process of creating that funeral unfolded?
So in that particular situation, like I said, it was one where it was family driven, and I believe there are ways that we can. And since then, I've learned how to drive it. Myself, and my team does a good job with that too. But in that case, I think a lot of it is listening, and is dialoguing and conversation, and it's helping people to realize that a funeral does not have to look like what it means in their mind. And I think we see that a lot in our profession. We see people who have what all of us would label and identify as a completely traditional funeral, and they just call it a celebration of life. That is literally the only different thing that happens. They put in the obituary celebration of life, and they say, well, we don't want a funeral, we want a celebration of life. And they do everything the exact same way. And then we see other people that will, the words, I don't call it anything you want. As long as you're having a ceremony, and as long as you're saying goodbye, and as long as you're putting something together that tells the person's story and is healing, could get behind that. And I think it's an important, powerful thing to do. So I don't have to call it a funeral. I could call it a memorial. I could call it a tribute. I could call it a celebration. I could call it, anything you want. But, people often walk in our doors and they know what they don't want more than they know what they do want. So I think it's about asking questions finding out where they find meaning, finding out what will help them on their healing journey, and then proposing ideas to do it. So while in this case, early in my career, it was the family that kind of led with the idea and said, here's what we want to do and here's how we could work together. I've learned in later years that, you could bring the idea to them. And sometimes it's about surprising them. Sometimes it's about not even asking for permission before you do it, of just doing it, because they'll be like, well, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to make a big deal. We don't want to make a fuss. And it's like, it's your mom. She deserves a big deal. She deserves a fuss. So sometimes if we do stuff like that, and we take the initiative and we take the lead, it blows them away and they're so thankful.
Yeah.
Was that a celebrant service, Matt? Who was the officiant?
No, it was not. It was, well, I guess I'm trying to remember. Believe it or not, Jimmy, it's been over 20 years now, so it's hard to remember the specifics of it. I know it was not a clergy person. I do know that the individual was not particularly religious, though his parents were. So the goal was to have ceremony and to have something to be able to say goodbye and to find a way to do it. So there was a master of ceremonies type role that we see through the celebrant training process is often talked about. So that there was an MC of sorts who led it and guided it, kept it organized and put it together, but wasn't necessarily speaking a ton themselves.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Hey, Jimmy, we're going to turn that the question over to you. I just wanted to say this too. I think Doug Manning, who just died this week, would really, I'd like to think he'd be proud of this podcast that we're talking about personalized funerals, right? We talked a little bit on the before we got rolling here about his influence in your life. Why don't you share a little bit with us about some of the things that you and your staff have done to help families coordinate, plan a really neat funeral.
And I'm going to, great moment to talk about Doug Manning for a minute and to give Matt condolences to him. He works real close with Glenda and Inside Institute, and knows Doug better than I've ever known Doug. I met Doug when I was a much younger man. Matt's a trainer, celebrant trainer, goes across the country and helps funeral homes. But for us, those services that are celebrant-led services where, you're actually helping a family understand what is possible. That it doesn't have to be, 3 songs and reading 23rd Psalm and, moving on. We can celebrate a life. We can get to, it's a storyteller, and and you can still bring your religion into it. And so we have a celebrant on staff. Those are my favorite services to be a part of. And I've never been a part of one of those services. I've officiated services, but I'm in no way a celebrant. That's my day to day. I've had the opportunity to hear Matt be a celebrant, and he knocks it out of the park. That's a different conversation. But I've never not heard someone come up to our celebrant and say, I want you to do my funeral. Every time someone says that, and it's, how long did you know John Smith? How long did you know Todd Carlson? Like, I never met him. I met him after he passed. And so what an awesome compliment that's the feedback. And there are themes to it, to Matt's point. You never know what's going to happen, because there are a lot of things that we try to do to get to know that individual and that family, to have a surprise or a giveaway at the end for those that are present. Man, he had a one that he called "Pooping on the Nazis." This guy was a World War II bomber pilot, and he talked about, he had a story, and so I was like, he said that in the middle of the services. I'm in the back. I'm like, yep, that's it. They're shutting us down. He's talking about pooping on the Nazis during this. Everybody rolled. It was perfect. And so I'm not doing it justice. So there goes this podcast. But I also look back on impactful services, and some of those are really hard. We had a gentleman that was hit by a drunk driver, and his wife was in the car, and the 2 kids were in the car. He happened to be an off-duty police officer, and He died instantly, and she was in the hospital for 4 weeks. We didn't have the service for like 6 weeks. He was from El Paso, obviously a first responder, so you had a first responder service, and it was just it was drawn out for 6 weeks until the wife could make the funeral. And then we had a very wealthy local businessman trying to figure out how to get from Fort Worth, Texas to El Paso, which if you own a road atlas, it's easy. I should just drive to New York from Fort Worth than to El Paso. It's like 1,000 miles. And he volunteered his airplane. I'm like, and I was getting all this information. I was like, well, that's really nice. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get everybody in there. Well, it was Ross Perot Jr. 737. And so we all got in there, including the casket, the honor guard, the family, city officials, everybody. I'm like, that'll work. That'll accommodate us. So there's those unique services that just, I think you said it, Matt, there's a lot of things sometimes out of your hands that are going on that you're just holding on. And first responder service is often like that. But to put unique touches on it, our celebrant services, that's our bread and butter. That's where we really shine. And the most positive services we have are celebrant led.
Well, before we get Gary's opinion here, Matt, I think we should circle back and just talk. I think ask you if you'd like to share a little bit about Doug's influence on your life and what he brought to funeral service from your perspective and what you've learned over the years. Because I think we did when we planned this podcast last week. We weren't here at this place in this time. With Doug and now living in our memories and in our hearts. So share a little bit with us, would you?
Yeah. Well, it's and I could say it now. He'll be laid to rest next Monday. I'm planning on going down and playing a role in that. I could say what I'm going to say there without ruining it because I don't think we'll broadcast before that. So, but I one of the things I mentioned, I think, and what I plan on saying was that they tell you should never meet your heroes because they turn into real people and they often don't live up to be the person on the pedestal that we make them to be. And, Doug Manning, I first encountered him when I was newly licensed. He spoke to the Connecticut Funeral Directors Association. And I just saw a guy that was able to articulate our experience and put it into words in a way that was so powerful that it was just transformative. And I think he played that role for a lot of people in our profession for such a long time that when I finally did have the honor to meet him and to get to know him, meeting your hero was not a bad thing in that situation. And I mean, Doug Manning was everything you imagined that he would be. He was kind, he was curious, he was truly invested in other people and who they were, and he asked questions because he cared, and he shared what he knew, but he didn't do it in a way of know-it-all or judgment. He did it because he wanted you to be better. And funeral service had no greater friend than Doug Manning. I mean, when he introduced the concept of training funeral celebrants to this country, some funeral directors and some of our associations were afraid that he was trying to create a parallel that was going to be a competition to us. And everything Doug did and said he did to try to build up the role of the funeral director and promote what it is that we do and the importance of what we do. And so even as someone that was not a funeral director himself, have devoted so much of his life to building up who we are, I think you would be hard pressed to find an individual in the last quarter of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st century who had a bigger profound impact on and potential of what we could do than Doug. I mean, I think of all the press releases I see with companies are going to disrupt funeral service. They're going to change funeral service. They're going to revolutionize funeral service. And 2 years later, their logo is gone and they're not there anymore. I think, Doug came as close as one has come to do that by helping us learn about the power of what we do, the importance of what we do, and how impactful it is to families during times of loss. And I was honored to be able to call him a friend, and I'm sorry that he's gone, but I'm certainly better because he was here.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you, Matt, for sharing that. And I think that's something it's like the lasting impact of a life. And if I just look at my career and say, if I can have just 10% of his impact, what would that be? I mean, that's just crazy. So, Well, thanks, and thanks for sharing that. And so, Gary, we're going to turn our attention to Spring Grove, and you shared last week on our last episode, in our inaugural episode, we'll call it that you're not a licensed funeral director, but you did go to Harvard. So see,
did he? All right, guys, you're going to get it now. I've had enough.
I'm going to do some work over here.
I don't think I knew that.
I'm going to develop an English accent just to tick you guys off.
Tell us more, Gary.
Yeah, that's what I want you to call me, Lord Gary.
Lord Gary. So Lord Gary. So no, hey, that's what I love about this group is just that picking on each other just to keep each other humble, right? Hey Gary, you have a great organization that you shepherd, and when you're thinking about the impact of these funerals, I mean, you can see it, the satisfaction that Matt and Jimmy have provided families directly in their care. You supervise the team, right? And you have a great staff of funeral professionals and cemeterians on your team. So just talk to us a little bit about when you get wind of a great service happening in your midst here in Cincinnati. Share with us a little bit about the impact of that on the people who work in your organization with you.
Yeah, and before I move on to that, I will answer your question, Todd. I just wanted to say, with regard to Doug, I was so impressed. I didn't know Doug that well, but I know Glenda a lot better. And once I met Glenda down at the university, the ICCFA University, we've been committed. Every single one of our funeral directors are celebrants. They have to go through training. That doesn't mean they're going to act as a celebrant, but I was so impressed by the concept and what was coming out of there and the people that went through it that I wanted every funeral director. And we allow any cemetery salesperson who's in the arrangement room, if they want to take celebrant service, if they want to become a celebrant, we allow them. It's just to understand how to connect with the family and how powerful the kinds of things you're talking about. So I'm a huge believer in celebrants and indebted to Mr. Manning. In terms of a really cool service, Spring Grove has done a bunch of them. I'm not coordinating them personally, but I think maybe we talked off the podcast last time. We did a service for about a 6-year-old boy 8 months ago that was really cool, that the funeral director, who has young children, connected with the family. And just briefly, the young man was really interested in dinosaurs. So the funeral director went home and made paleontologist badges for every kid that showed up at the service, and they had draw your favorite dinosaur. And then one of the things I thought, there was all kinds of decorations and all the kind of stuff that, like Matt was talking about with the stage. What I thought the coolest thing was, instead of a moment of silence, they did a moment of roar, or a moment of chaos, where everybody at the funeral did their best dinosaur roar.
Wow.
I thought was really cool and really connected with the family as well.
What was yours, Gary? Will you do that for us?
Let's do it now.
Squeak. Mine's a little mammal.
1, 2, 3, go.
But on this topic, I wanted to hit one of the conceptual thing that on a concept I stole from Doug Gober, whole cloth. And that is one of the things I don't think our profession does a good enough job on. We are really hyper-focused on the family and the extended family, but there are usually 50 to 200 people there. A lot of them didn't even know the decedent, so they're not in grief. But the power of having those services is you get what, I can't remember, I think it was Jimmy that said, hey, I want you to do my service. You start teaching the public that a funeral doesn't have to be what they think a funeral is. Because, I know this from firsthand experience, people I've talked to, they've rejected their organized religion. They don't want a traditional service. So they just say, I'm just going to get cremated. I don't want to have a funeral. Well, a gathering's the same as a funeral, is the same as a celebration of life, whatever you want to call it. It's about recognizing, and this gets back to your disrupting thing. I hope I'm not jumping topics too much, but people think they want to disrupt it. This is ultimately a face-to-face, heart-to-heart kind of profession. And I believe that will not go away, because I believe that part of human existence is when somebody passes, that human beings need to stop. They need to recognize that this person had an impact on their life and that they'll miss them. How they go about saying that can go hundreds of thousands of different routes, from I want to go back to the church because that's what's meaningful to me, or no, I want to do something different. About 18 months ago, our ex-retired CFO, who came to us from the Reds, he was actually the CFO of the Reds. We did an entire Reds theme with hot dogs and Cracker Jack and popcorn and all that other stuff. And I think a little bit of that was led from the family because it was such a part of his life. But I don't think you can underestimate the power it has. And it's not just on the family. It's not just on the people grieving. We at Spring Grove, we want everybody to walk out of every funeral as best we can, knowing more about the person, the decedent, than they did walking in. Mm-hmm. And I think we're pretty successful. Maybe not 100%, but that's the goal.
Yeah, that's you always strive for perfection. Alan Wolfelt is big on the why of funeral ceremony, and not just for the family, but an opportunity for the whole community, right? And then you said something about celebrant services, and Matt did too, that one person that I know that we know that has data on this because all of his folks are celebrant certified, Ernie Hefner. I mean, he has a presentation on it. It's pretty impressive, the stats on purposeful, meaningful celebrant services.
I would just add on to that too. You know, because I think Gary, you mentioned the 50 non-grieving people who were there, and you put them in a room at a country club, and you give them some wine and cheese, and that's the sum total. And there's some photo boards up, like that's the celebration of life that you want to do. Like that's not helpful, and that's not healing. I mean, when you have the people who are in the room, they walk up to Jimmy, who led us something, and they say, "How long did you know Mrs. Johnson for?" And he said, "I never met her," and they never met her either. But he told enough of a story, and it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't take an hour to do this. But he told enough of her story to paint a picture of her life that when they walked out of that room, they got to know who she was as well. And their daughter that is in the cubicle next to them at work, and they just came to pay their respects, they're now able to go the next day at work when they see her again and say, you know, my mom used to knit Afghans for all the babies in our family too. Or my dad also taught me how to fly fish. Or they have those things that create those connections to give the grieving family companions on the journey. And that's what it's about. So they don't have to walk that path alone. They have some there to help them. And that's what the service and the ceremony does. It gives them, you know, people to walk with. Like, you know, sharing a couple cubes of cheddar and a glass of Chardonnay doesn't do that. And it's not to say it doesn't have a role. It's not to say that it doesn't have a purpose and a point. But like Jimmy said, when people walk up and I want you to do mine, or I've never been to a funeral like that before, or that great compliment, which is like, that's the best funeral I've ever been to. And people feel funny saying it, but very often it's not about the prop. It's not about the setting. It's not about tchotchkes or, you know, the commercial personalization. It's about the personalization of sharing the person's story. And I think that's the real power of what we do.
Well, first of all, Matt, Chardonnay doesn't go with cheddar.
Yeah, well.
Come on, Matt.
Yeah.
It was a test.
Todd, can we bust each other's balls now? Is this the part where
that's the time? Yeah, you know, Matt, that triggered a memory when I was doing my summer apprentice work right out of mortuary school. I was with a funeral director now. His name is Bob, and he died a long time ago. But he was meeting with a family, and I was learning. I was just in the room listening and being a sponge. And he heard this whole lady's story about her husband. And because I have a point to this story, and then we'll give some follow up. But he got to the point where he'd understood where this lady was coming from. He demonstrated his understanding by saying, "Ma'am, it sounds like your husband loved you so much he almost told you that one time." And she burst into laughter and tears, and that amazed me. And here's where I'm going with this, because I'd like to address this, because the idea here is how do we put these things into action? How do we put these ideas into play? What he did, and you mentioned it, is he took a risk, right? He took a risk by saying that, because there have been a lot of people, a lot of funeral directors I know that would never take that risk. And I think that maybe is sometimes why we don't jump in and deliver that delight or that surprise or that unexpected part, because we're afraid of something going wrong, or something not unfolding correctly, or, you know, something not happening. So let's, Matt, how do you and your staff deal with that tension between surprising and delighting a family and taking that risk?
I think the courage comes the more you do it. And I think you begin to realize that you get a lot more wins than losses when you do that. And that if it is a loss, even in the moment, you know, you're probably not going to super offend a person. And even if you do, if past that moment, I think they'll ultimately see that if you said I did it from a good place because I was trying to help and I was trying to heal and I was trying to make something special for you, they'll appreciate it. And there have been times we've tried things that we thought they'd like and they kind of stare at you like you're a little different. And then you're like, well, we'll stop it or move it to another room. Like,
Cue the band.
Yeah. Like, well,
Yeah.
or not. Did we put your mom's name on someone else's product? So you kind of like, move along in those cases. But more often than not, there's things I've done where I've been like, this is stupid. Like, no one's ever going to like this. This is ridiculous. And then like, well, someone came up with the idea. I'm going to support them in the effort. And then the family loves it. And they're like, that was, I tell stories too. Once I put ketchup packets out at a funeral. Because the guy mentioned his obituary that they wrote, we hope the angels have enough ketchup in heaven, because he always kept his Heinz bottle next to his place at the table. So I had a basket of ketchup packets. That family thought it was the greatest thing. At the cemetery, they didn't put roses on his casket. They all took their ketchup packets and they put it on top of the casket.
Oh, bravo.
The engraving of his branch of service and his name. And they were all sitting there taking pictures of it with their cell phone. His wife passed a year later, and I was away on a celebrant training, and they said, please don't tell Matt that Mom loved bacon.
You sure as hell better have had French fries, by the way. Good Lord.
I heard some of the church in the Northeast have bacon smelling candles. Double dip there.
But my point is, though, like, if it was wrong, then I moved the ketchup in another room, like but it was a hit and they liked it. So
yeah, but that's, Matt, don't you think that's knowing your crowd and being purposeful and active listening and asking those clarifying questions? And it's not like you just go, ta-da, hope you like it. It's you spent some time digging into, you didn't just pick up the proverbial pen and ask, what's their maiden name, date of birth, and their social security number. You spend some time.
I am not fast making arrangements. So by the time I leave that room, I think I have a pretty good sense of the personalities and who the family is. And listen, there are some people where, I know pretty soon, like, I am not cracking a joke the entire time I'm with them. Like, I will not break professionalism once. Like, they will not appreciate it. And then there's other people where the story Todd told, where it was well received and it was healing for. I mean, you kind of get a sense of who the people are. That comes with time. I think some people, when you're a 22-year-old funeral director and you're just starting, you may not have the courage to do that. If someone's 50 years older than you, but as time comes, you get a sense of it, and and it's also just being true to yourself. Like, if you're, you have to know your own personality and embrace that for good or bad. Good in Jimmy's case, bad in Gary's.
Soft skills are real, and not everybody has those soft skills anymore. And we live in a cell phone society, and you got to get out and look someone in the eye and feel that energy, watch the body language, and have a conversation. Don't get me started on soft skills.
Well, Gary, how do you handle that in your staff? How do you encourage the creative elements and really taking risks with families in a good way?
Well, there's a lot of anecdotal sharing about things that went very well and kudos from the families and things like that. And that's really, John Oran told me a long time ago, funeral directors don't work for money, they work for hugs. You got to pay them so they can feed themselves, right? That emotional connection, that feedback. But I want to talk about something that's a little bit on this edge of this topic, and that is the leadership of the funeral home. If you are going to be a truly innovative funeral home, you're going to have things like Matt talked about, that's a swing and a miss, or maybe even worse than a swing and a miss. And as the leadership of the firm, you have to make sure that you support that funeral director, because something's going to go wrong. These customized services, you're going to get more and more variables, more and more complexity, right? And every once in a while, something's going to go horribly awry. The hard part for the leadership is not to go back to that funeral director and say, how could you let this happen? And the hardest part is, if you're sitting in the room with the family and they've been screaming at you for 45 minutes, what I tell our leadership team is, go home and talk to the funeral director tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Because unless they did something that was literally motivated by self-interest, I want that funeral director to know from my leadership team that we appreciate the risk they took hey, this one didn't work. And the other thing I tell if you own a funeral home, get ready to pay for some funerals. Because if you're not, and the first time, the analogy I use is the first time that you go down to that funeral director where something went horribly wrong, and you climb on top of them and scream at them for a while, when do you think the next time that funeral director is going to innovate? They will never step outside the box again, right? Whatever disciplinary action you use with them. But it's hard as a leader not to be screamed at for 45 minutes and then go down and then talk to this employee that made a mistake, or maybe not. Maybe it was the dove release guy shows up. We had one where dove release guy came in and released these doves. One of them flew into a monument and broke its neck, and one of them was blown out of the air by a red-tailed hawk. Same funeral.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh.
So, again, was that anybody's fault? No, it came unwound. So, you adapt from that. You apologize. Maybe you pay for something as the company. But the key is to go back to the frontline people, whether it's a cemetery service person or a funeral service person, and say, look, that's what we need to do. That's the most important thing, is trying to educate the public that a funeral can be a wide variety of things. And, as we move away from religion as a country, all of these things are going to get more secular, more individualized, and that just adds complexity, more things that can go wrong. So it's just about a mindset in the leadership that going in, I'm going to pay for 5 funerals this year because something's going to go wrong, and that's okay. You just problem solve from there, right? It's just part of you're running a machining company, you're going to get 4% defective parts, right? You want to move it to 3%, but you're still going to get them. You can't get mad at the machine tool operator because you got a rejection rate. So anyway, I think it's important to say, especially for somebody that's running a multi-generation funeral home where they're not directly in the service provision. In the larger firms where you're just coming in at the end, or maybe you say hi to the family and then all of a sudden you get a phone call and they're screaming at you, hey, let's problem solve first, figure out what went wrong, make the company, the customer happy, and then we'll figure out down the road, was this, is this something we want to try again? Or no, this doesn't work for funeral service. Or if it does, we got to find a new vendor because this person doesn't know what they're doing. All of those could be possible solutions. So that's kind of the way I look at it. I don't get my heart rate up when something goes wrong unless it's something our employee did that was just egregious or in their own self-interest. Yeah, I told them they couldn't have a service on Saturday because I've got something I'm doing with my kids this weekend.
Yeah,
that kind of stuff you can't put up with. But the rest of it, they're trying to make it innovative, trying to make it cool, and the ketchup packets get all over the floor. Well, clean the carpet, move on.
They couldn't eat the ketchup. We're in Connecticut. There's no food or beverages in funeral homes.
Oh, there you go.
All right. Well,
I was going to say we don't allow dove releases the first week of September here in Texas because of dove season. So things could go wrong.
Yeah, we
down
don't have
here.
that problem.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, I think it's time we put a wrap on this. I do want to thank everyone for sharing. Oh, and Gary, oh my goodness,
You asked for it.
Yeah. But yeah, I want to thank everyone for listening here to the Graveyard Shift today, and really appreciate the investment of your time in improving yourselves and the services that you provide to families. We hope to be publishing a podcast or two a month here over the upcoming years here, and we just want to help contribute to the success of your funeral home. I think that's what's in the heart of this the cast and crew of this podcast. And a couple things, just real simply. And one of our founders, Bill Seal, said this. He said, the best advertising for a funeral is a great funeral. And I think that's the lesson of today's podcast, is take the risk. So I'm going to ask our listeners to do a couple things. First of all, put something that you heard today or that you learned today into use. Have a bias for action. I'm just going to encourage you to take a risk. Right. And from that risk will come the reward, and just know you're going to win a lot more than you're going to lose. And if you come from the right place with the spirit of caring and the spirit of service, families are going to be okay. And the second thing is, don't keep us a secret. We want you to share this podcast with your friends, and given the nature of this cast, I encourage you to share it with your enemies too. And we'll take it from there. So, Anyways, so long. Have a great week, everyone. Talk to you soon.